the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his path. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem.
All right, well, we've introduced Ruth beginning last week, and so this morning we're going to start with the opening, the first 6 verses, and really set the stage for what follows as the story unfolds. And last week I had forgotten at the end of the lesson to recommend a few resources, so I want to do that before I forget. It may seem like I have a lot of books, but believe me, I've winnowed this down to just the best. So the 2 that I recommend the most, that I've found the most helpful for Ruth are, one is by Robert Chisholm. He teaches at Dallas Theological Seminary, and this just came out in, I think, 2013. And he's very helpful in terms of the literary features of the book of Ruth. We talked a little bit about that last week, the literary features as a narrative, how the storyteller brings out certain aspects. So this is a good one. And then probably my all-around favorite is Daniel Block. He teaches at Wheaton College, and this is in the New American Commentary series, and again, it's Judges and Ruth. So these are good introductory commentaries. If you're a little bit more advanced and want something a little bit more, 2 other ones that are good, Robert Hubbard, The Book of Ruth, in the New International Commentary series. And then this is probably the best all around, but it's a little more technical, Frederick Bush in the Word Biblical Commentary series. So these will be up here if you want to look at them afterwards and decide if there's a resource that might be helpful to you. And of course, I'll be handing out notes as I do every week as we go from week to week as we enter into the story. Well, this week I came across an interesting account of something that happened during World War II. Obviously, I'm much of a history buff, and I'm almost always reading some sort of book on history, particularly the wars and things of that nature. And I came across this story of a young lady named Monica Littleboy. Monica Littleboy. She was a dentist's daughter in Norfolk, England, during World War II. And when the war came along, she, as many others, moved to the city to try to pitch in and be of what help she could. And while she was there, she met a young man who seemed at the time very dashing, charming, very courteous. And so she began to really have feelings toward him. But then the war broke out, and he was, of course, commissioned and sent away. And he told her one day that he was leaving London to join his grandfather's regiment, the Gordon Highlanders, in Scotland. He was of Scottish derivation. So as the events unfolded, Monica kind of moved on with her life, and she dated several other men during the war. In fact, she heard little about George other than that he had been dispatched to Malaya, which would eventually become Malaysia, in 1941. Kind of dropped off the scene. She dated several other men, and eventually there was one in particular that she was interested in that it looked like it might promise marriage. So as time went on, several years later, out of the blue, in the fall of 1945, she receives a telephone call. Picks it up, and it's George on the other end. He's just returned, and he asks if he can come and see her. She hesitates a little bit because she's already going steady, as they would say, with a boy and very promising young man whom she's very interested in. But she says, well, go. Yeah, that's fine. Come on over. So he does. He's come right off the ship. When he opens the door, she opens the door to see him. This is what she says. I couldn't believe my eyes. This was not the young man I had known. He had been a prisoner of war for 4 years in a Japanese prisoner of war camp. Misshapen, pitted, scarred, only the eyes were the same. I thought of the handsome boyfriend I was to meet next weekend, tall, dark, in command of every situation. Then I looked at this hulk of humanity, and my heart bled. Well, George took a train to Scotland to visit his parents, and she went on with her date but couldn't get out of her mind George. He came back and he developed malaria, was in the hospital, and during the course of that, she made a fateful decision that she would help George return back to the life that he had, to become the man that he was before the war. She said this, "Could I keep this man alive and help him to get back into life again? I loved the spirit of the man, but could love nothing else, but I had to do it." So they married in the spring of 1946 and had a very difficult time over the years. George had a lot of emotional and physical scars that he carried with him from the war. But she was able to gradually nurse him back to health and back to vitality, and they lived together until he passed away in 2000. But I thought this was a great account of how Monica Littleboy's love for George, her desire to nurse him back to health and vitality, mirrors what we see, I think, taking place in the book of Ruth. In Ruth, we have broken people who, because of the ravages of life that they've experienced, are at the brink of giving up, giving in to despair. And in particularly at the outbreak here of the story, it almost seems to the characters involved that God is silent and not there. Remember, Francis Schaeffer wrote a famous book decades ago, The God Who Is There. But sometimes we all would have to admit we contend with what seems to be the hiddenness of God. And it seems that the characters at the opening of the story are sensing that, wondering what's happening. How do we deal with these difficulties, these challenges that have come into our lives? So with that in mind, I want to begin by reading this account, and I have a translation there that I've translated for you, and just want to bring out some things as we read through this. This is just the first 6 verses, so a fairly short portion, but it sets the tone for what follows. So you can follow along as I read, and I've included a couple of extra things here because the narrator seems to ironically use the meaning of names to a certain flourish in the story. So it begins in verse 1. Now in the days when the judges judged, there arose a famine in the land, and a certain man from Bethlehem, a Hebrew reader would know, of course, that Bethlehem means house of bread. So this is ironic that there's a famine in the house of bread. In Judah, went to sojourn in the fields of Moab. Now you'll notice, as I said last week, whenever Israel is described, it's the land. Whenever Moab is described, it's the field or the fields. And I think this goes all the way back to the Genesis account where the land is what God creates for his people to flourish and to be blessed, to experience peace and shalom in. And the fields are outside the pale of that blessing of God. It's the wild, uncultivated area. In Genesis 25:27, when Jacob and Esau are distinguished, Esau is a man of the fields. He has the scent of wild game. Jacob, on the other hand, is a word that's very hard to translate. Some say he is a quiet man. Really, the meaning is he's a holistic man. You could almost say a perfect man. It's the same word used to describe Job. He's a man of integrity. He lives in tents. He's cultivating the land. All right, continuing. He, his wife, and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech. Now again, this is significant. The name here means my God is king. The name of his wife was Naomi, which means pleasantness or sweetness. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon, which ironically means weak or sickly person, and Chilion, which means frail mortal. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They entered the fields of Moab and remained there. Now Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They took for themselves Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, not Oprah. Although I think she actually was named after this character, if you've heard the story. And the name of the second was Ruth. And they lived there about 10 years, the 2 of them. Mahlon and Chilion also died, and the woman was bereft of her 2 boys and her husband. This is the only time in Hebrew where married men are called, the Hebrew word yeled, boys. But this links the fact that she'll get a boy to replace them later in the book. So she arose together with her daughters-in-law to return from the fields of Moab. For she had heard from the field of Moab that the Lord had visited his people to give them bread. Again, referring back to Bethlehem. The house of bread, as one commentator says, has been restocked, and God has provided. All right, so we enter into this account, and there's all sorts of interesting nuances and features and facets of this story that the narrator includes. But I also want to point out that it'll become evident as we go along that as much as the narrator in Hebrew literature artfully constructs these stories, we also have to acknowledge that there are very often times where he omits certain details that we as the reader have to fill in. Scholars of biblical literature call this gapping. The idea of gapping is we are privy to certain facts, but there is much that's left unsaid. And so as the reader, we have to kind of fill in what's going on sometimes behind the scenes. And one of the major questions that comes about, and this is when we get to the second side of the handout, we'll deal with this, is are they experiencing the judgment of the Lord in this foreign land? In other words, when Elimelech dies and then his sons, is this God's judgment because they've disobeyed somehow, they've left where they're supposed to be, and so God has judged them? So that's one of the things we'll have to fill in as we go along, so keep that in mind as we work through it. All right, so let's begin. I just want to point out some things as we go through this story that are of interest and may help us understand what the narrator is trying to tell us. All right, so the story begins, as we noticed last week, in the days when the judges judged. Now, immediately, that sets up a context for us, both a historical context and a social context, as well as a religious context. Right? If we think about this story taking place when the judges judged, what might immediately come to mind? What sort of period in Israel's history was the epoch in which the judges ruled? What do you think? How would you describe it if you were to describe it in one word or phrase?
Well, whenever I think of judges, I always think every man did what was right in his own eyes.
Right. Yes, the common refrain at the latter stage of the book there is, there was no king in Israel, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So as a reader, we're set up to think, oh boy, here comes another story about everyone doing what is right in their own eyes. So this serves as a foil for what actually happens in Ruth, and that is that God redemptively brings life out of death. But it takes a little while for us to get there. What's interesting about this is that that backdrop of the judges, at least at the beginning, seems to be panning out because it's almost unheard of that we would be introduced to a character like Elimelech and then in the very next verse he dies. Very strange. It doesn't often happen in Hebrew narrative. So at the outset we're thinking this is another story that's going downward. And I think we'll see that the narrator is at least leading us into this way of thinking initially. All right, so really two things that we could say about the time when the judges judged. Number one, it brings out this moral and political religious chaos that was characteristic of the time of the judges. Everyone doing what's right in their own eyes. There seems to be no cohesion. By the end of the book of Judges, we realize that they've nearly exterminated one of their own tribes. Levites are offering their services for hire. There just seems to be complete moral chaos. Probably the most gruesome story in all the Bible is toward the end of Judges, where the man hacks his concubine to pieces and mails her. And so we see just complete moral perversion and chaos. That's the backdrop. But the other hint that's in there is that was a time, that was a day when the judges judged, but there ultimately will come something better. And so the book ends, as we noted last week, with the word David. The last word of the book of Ruth is David, with that glimmer of hope that there's coming a king who will bring us back to where we need to be. All right, so it's in this time frame, a famine comes along, and a certain man from Bethlehem, the house of bread, leaves to sojourn in the fields of Moab. All right, let me point out a couple things. I have two charts here for you. Number one is at the bottom of this first page, and I thought this was interesting just to think about. With this backdrop of the story of the Judges, I noted last week that this is really the third consecutive narrative in which Bethlehem is focused upon. We have in Judges 17 and 18 a story that revolves around a young Levite from Bethlehem. In 19 to 21 of Judges, we have a story revolving around this concubine married to a Levite, and she originates from Bethlehem. Then we come to Ruth, and again we have a story focused on Bethlehem. But immediately we begin to see, even though we might think this is another Judges story, there are stark differences. So for instance, let me just point out a couple. In Judges, we have wandering exiles who leave their home, Bethlehem, but never return to live there. Elimelech and his family, however, wander into exile in Moab, but ultimately Naomi and Ruth return to raise up a name for Elimelech's household. This is an important concept in the Old Testament for sure, this idea of place. If you've been to Israel, they have a Holocaust memorial there in Jerusalem that is something to see, and the name of it is Yad Vashem, which means a hand in the name. The idea is everyone should have a place to be remembered, to have rootedness, to have somewhere to belong. This is a common theme in Old Testament literature, this idea of exile and return, having a place to settle. And so they return to the homestead. They return to Bethlehem and raise up a name. A couple other interesting parallels. The major characters in Judges fail in the face of challenges and particularly abandon their responsibilities. Everything you think they should be doing, they're not doing. Particularly the Levites, who should be the spiritual leaders, and they're failing dramatically. However, in Ruth, the major characters persevere. They bear the responsibilities. They eventually succeed in the face of challenges, but not without struggle. What's interesting, in Judges, men treat women insensitively, shamefully, and violently. Whereas in Ruth, men treat women with dignity and sensitivity as partners in a common mission. And I think this points forward even to the greater Boaz, how the Lord Jesus himself does this. In Judges, a city council convenes toward the end to implement a failed plan for exterminating evil. This internecine civil war, which follows, nearly wipes out the Benjaminites, and they have to come up with this strange plot to replenish them with wives. You remember they kidnapped the women from Shiloh during the festival. If you've ever seen the movie Seven Brides for Seven Brothers, one of my favorite movies. Even though I don't like musicals, but it's a pretty good movie. Yeah, where they do the same thing. It's kidnapping the women to marry them, right? So this happens in Judges, but in Ruth, the city council convenes to bless the marriage union so that they can perpetuate the line of Elimelech, and this comes to fruition with the birth of Obed. In Judges, we have idolatry and divination. They're seeking to manipulate God for blessing. In Ruth, they obey. They have integrity and faith, and God blesses them in turn. They wait for God's blessing. They don't take it to themselves to manufacture the situation. And then lastly, the people of Shiloh must show kindness by allowing the Benjaminites to abduct and forcefully marry their young women. It uses the word kindness there, almost ironically. And in Ruth, Ruth shows kindness by her fidelity to Naomi. You remember, Naomi is really the central character of the book of Ruth. And Ruth shows kindness by being faithful to Naomi and by her allegiance to Boaz. And Boaz says this in chapter 3. You could have chosen one of the young men, but you've been faithful. Your kindness in this situation is greater even than your previous kindness. And so Ruth really operates as a redemptive figure in that sense. Okay, so this is the backdrop. It's the idea of the Judges and the moral and spiritual chaos that follows. So during that time, something happens. A famine comes along. Now the question is this famine and everything that follows divine judgment? Is God judging the land? If we overlay Ruth with Judges, we don't really have an account in Judges that mirrors this particular famine. So it's raised a lot of questions. Is this a Israel-wide famine or more of a localized affair? The fact that they go to Moab suggests it's perhaps more of a localized affair in southern Judah, because if you're familiar with the geography of the land and you looked at the maps in the back of your Bible, you see that Moab is a bit east, and it's quite possible that there they do have food, whereas in Judah there could be a famine. So perhaps this is a localized famine. We don't really know much information about it, but for whatever reason, Bethlehem has no food, so Elimelech decides to leave. Now, how are we to view Elimelech? This is one of the major questions that we have to face when we're working through this. We're introduced to him in verse 2. It says, the name of the man was Elimelech, and his name means, my God is king. Now, why might that be an ironic name for the character here of Elimelech to have? It's during what period of time? During the time of the Judges. Now, admittedly, during the time of the Judges, Israel was operating as a theocracy, right? We're familiar with this word. So the idea was, you don't need a human king because God is your king. But what was the actual historical outcome of that scenario? Right? It was complete chaos. Everyone doing what's right in their own eyes. So even though it should have functioned the right way, it wasn't. And later on, you remember when Samuel is told to go and anoint Saul, he grieves. And God tells him, they haven't rejected you, they've rejected me. All right, so we have this man who should be an outstanding citizen during the time of the Judges because God is king. But what does he have to do? He has to leave the kingdom, right? He has to seek refuge and sustenance outside of the land. So he goes and he lives, sojourns in the fields of Moab. Now, what does it mean to sojourn in the fields of Moab? If you're very familiar with what life would have been like in the ancient Near East, if you were a sojourner, what sort of a life could you expect as kind of an outsider, if you will, a sojourner?
Wanderer.
Okay, wanderer?
It'd probably be like our immigrants, the workers that work in the fields and stuff. They live in either trailers or little small places, and
Right.
a whole bunch of them live together, something like
Right.
that.
Not very pleasant living conditions. Somebody say something over here?
I said slave.
Slave, okay. Yeah, you're certainly susceptible to being taken advantage of. You're marginalized. People don't really like you. Okay, James?
Well, you just kind of have to watch out for yourself, is you're kind of alone in that sense and isolated. And the fact that the Old Testament repeats over and over again, do not oppress the alien or the foreigner in your midst, implies that in that area of the world that must have been common practice, that if you're not one of us, you're not part of our culture, then they're ostracized and not allowed to participate in a lot of the needful economic activity, or at least somewhat prejudiced in that sense.
Right. Right, so it's a dangerous place to be, particularly in the ancient world where you can be taken advantage of, sold into slavery, other things. Terry?
And I don't know, but to me, I don't know if it's true or not, but I picture that if you were a Jewish person, just the way you look and dress, people would know you were a Jewish person, and I didn't think the Moab people liked the Jewish people.
Right.
I don't know, so he must have been desperate for food, I think, to have done that.
Right. Yeah, it's an interesting situation because the Jewish people and the Moabite people have some kinship, distant relation through Abraham and Lot and their families. But at the same time, early in the book of Judges, Eglon, the king of Moab, is one of the first oppressors who oppresses Israel. And so there's really a love-hate relationship there. Moab refuses to help Israel when they're passing through on their way to the Promised Land coming out of Egypt. They don't help them in any way. In fact, they try to seduce them, as Numbers 25 tells us. And so there's a very tense relationship, you might say, between the two nations. All right, so as a sojourner, Elimelech is an outsider. He's in a precarious situation because he could easily be taken advantage of. You can think, I mean, the analogy just holds so true today. Someone who comes into the U.S. and doesn't know the language or the culture or the customs can easily be taken advantage of because they don't know the insider knowledge. If you've ever been to a foreign country, you can readily identify with this feeling. The worst night for me always in a foreign country is the first night when you get there and you think everybody's trying to steal your luggage. You don't know where to go. You're just unsure of how to navigate life. And so Elimelech's somewhat in this situation as he comes now to the fields of Moab. And again, this is a nation, but the narrator specifically says it's a field. And the reason he does this, I want to suggest, is Elimelech is to be seen really as in exile. He's in exile from the land, and he's trying to scrape together an existence here in Moab. All right, so he comes. We're introduced to the names of his wife and his 2 sons. Now let me just say a word about this. What's interesting is in the book of Ruth, this has kind of puzzled commentators, but all the names seem to have something of an ironic twist to them. Now, one commentator brings out a good point that in the ancient Near East, they often wouldn't name their children until they had passed the infant stage because infant mortality rates were so high. So until the child was weaned, they would often hold off on naming the child. So if we think of that and then think of the fact that if these children are born during the time of famine, we maybe wouldn't be surprised that they have names that reflect their sickly, weak situation, that they're children that almost don't make it. So the firstborn is weak, sickly person, and Kilian is the frail mortal. That name comes from a Hebrew word that means to come to an end, to be finished, or to be mortal. So the sense here is perhaps these 2 sons almost don't make it. They're sickly, and in fact, they will succumb early on to whatever takes their lives. Again, the narrator doesn't tell us a lot. There's a lot we could wish we knew, but we just don't know. And so they soon pass off the scene. Naomi will be left. She's the one who's pleasant and sweet, right? And she'll, later on in the chapter 1, use that as a wordplay to say, no, call me Mara. I'm coming back a bitter woman. All right, so they come into Moab and they settle there. And one more word that we get is that they are Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. That's a phrase that probably we often just skip over because we don't really know what that means. What does it mean that they were Ephrathites? Well, there's 2 possibilities. It could be a genealogical name, meaning it's part of their family line, or the name of a village which was outside of Bethlehem. So we see both instances of this used. So for instance, in Genesis, Rachel is about to die, and so we have that they're trying to make it to Ephrathah before she passes away. This idea of a village outside that's linked to Bethlehem. But in another passage, such as 1 Chronicles 4:4, we are introduced to an individual named Ephrathah. He's the father of Bethlehem. So there's some question about what this means. I lean toward the fact that this is a family designation. They were Ephrathites, meaning they were part of this Judahite clan in particular. And if that's the case, then this is the little enclave, their family, if you will, within Bethlehem. Okay, so they're Judahite. So again, the stories here focus on the tribe of Judah. Judah becomes very important, and I think this is why the Old Testament witnesses to Christ, because Judah, from the very beginning, is a significant tribe. And this really struck me when we studied Joshua. I don't remember if you remember that series, we went through Joshua, but the second half of Joshua is really told from a Judahite perspective. Judah is the central tribe there. So that seems to be a common strain. So they come out of Judah, they go into Moab, and they live there. Now, verse 3 has the surprise. We're expecting Elimelech to do something great, but he dies. And Naomi is bereft of her husband. You'll notice then, verse 4, they take for themselves Moabite wives. Now, the implication is that perhaps this has happened after Elimelech's death. Now, if this is the case, that Elimelech dies and then they take for themselves wives, should we view this as a positive development or as a negative development? In other words, should we say, well, of course, they're living in Moab, it's likely that they'll take Moabite wives? Or as a reader, should we immediately think, this doesn't sound good? There's an ominous note here. The music, the music is queued up and something's about to happen. They've taken Moabite wives. What do you think? I'm curious to know, if, as you're reading this, how would it strike you? Knowing what we know about the background of how Israel was to behave itself in the ancient Near East, do you think the original reader would think this is a good thing or this is a not so good thing?
It's a negative connotation for me because Moab doesn't have any positive connotations when it comes to Israel.
Right. Okay. Somebody else have a thought?
What did he say?
He said it takes a negative connotation for him because Moab doesn't really have many positive features in the Old Testament. Okay, Dave?
The Israelites were warned against marrying and intermingling with the Moabites and other countries around them, but specifically Moabites was mentioned as part of their laws.
Yeah, in several instances. For instance, one of the starkest is in Deuteronomy 23, where it says, no Moabite can come into the assembly of the Lord up to 10 generations. So that's a pretty strong statement. And it's interesting to me because that would even exclude David, technically. So we have to think about that, and we'll talk about that when we get to the end of the book. Terry, you had a thought?
Sometimes historically in the Bible, it seems like you can have really strong religious leaders, Moses, and once they pass away, the strength of their conviction sometimes gets diminished or watered down. And so if the father was still having God as his king and he was holding the moral, he got the moral helm, I guess, then once he died, then if they didn't internalize their religion or his faith, then they were weaker and
Right.
did what they wanted to do.
Yeah, I tend to see that as the case as well. That they've lost kind of their rudder maybe, and it's almost a concession now on the part of Naomi. Okay, go ahead.
I think it also shows permanency, if they're going to stay.
Right. Yep.
It doesn't depend on the family.
Right.
So,
Yep, that's a great point. So originally they're coming to sojourn, but marrying suggests a little bit more, right? They've become local. Somebody else have a thought? Pam?
Maybe they were desperate and the family name was so high.
Okay. Yep. James?
Well, there's a lot of interesting stuff in the Bible because the Edom and Moab. It's both the Moabites and the Edomites who are descended from people who were worshippers of the one true God, but both had turned aside to paganism and had actually betrayed Israel on several occasions. Specifically, we talked about the Exodus. The Israelites came to Israel, the Holy Land, expecting the Edomites and Moabites to welcome them back as long-lost brothers.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think a lot of the animosity towards Moab and Edom is the idea that they were traitors to their relatives, if you will.
Right.
And with family ties being so big, the Israelite culture is where a lot of the animosity comes from, is they're viewed as traitors. And so this adds to the irony of Ruth, because we expect, oh, she's a Moabite. She's a relative, but a traitor to the family of Israel, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
But then she's actually the most faithful one.
Right. Yeah, particularly with Edom, they felt that keenly, that sense of alienation from what should be their brothers. But it certainly was the case also with Moab. All right, any other thoughts? Did I see any other hands? Yes, Chris.
I just had a thought too, is if the Israelites would have been kind of shunned by Moabites, the fact that two Moabite families allowed these Israelite boys to marry their daughters kind of tells me that they were looking a lot more like Moabites than they were Israelites.
Mm-hmm.
So, that they had maybe whatever they was supposed to set them apart more and more wasn't showing up. So
Right.
the Moabites were okay with them You know, like we're supposed to stand apart as believers. But it's kind of like I worry if I'm fitting in too much.
Right.
Then you start to worry as a Christian. It's like, well, wait a minute, maybe something's wrong here.
Right.
And so for the Moabites to even let them marry their daughters is kind of interesting to me.
Yeah. And you bring out an interesting point. If you look at the book of Judges, there seems to be a gradual downgrade in the quality of the judges, beginning with Othniel toward the end. And when you get to Samson, he has this thing for Philistine women, but it really shows he is Philistine at heart. You know, he's an apostate who is very given and susceptible to that. So it seems that they've bought into the culture as much as can be expected, and they've taken now for themselves Moabite wives. Now, Jewish tradition says that Orpah and Ruth were sisters, but of course we don't know for sure that that's the case. Some of the rabbis said that they thought Ruth descended from Eglon, the king of Moab, but again, that's speculative. I'm not sure that that's necessarily the case. We're really not told. All we know is there are two women whom they marry. And what's interesting is even these names are interesting, although I didn't include them because there's a little bit more speculation of what they mean. But Orpah is generally said to mean something about the neck or the back. And so the thought is, in Jewish tradition and other traditions, that she turns her back on Naomi. So it's ironic in that sense. And then Ruth, there's some question, but most say it means something like friend or companion. So the idea that Ruth would be a companion and a friend to Naomi. Now, so we're introduced to all these characters and given their names, and we don't know much about them, but the story continues after they lived there about 10 years. Now again, if we fill in the gap, this suggests that, at least in Ruth's case, they've lived 10 years with no children. So it seems that Ruth is a barren wife. Now this means later in the story when Boaz marries her, it brings the additional baggage that perhaps he's marrying a barren woman. And so God must intervene if she's to have children. Well, then the two die, Mahlon and Chilion, and Naomi is left alone, bereft of her two boys. As I said before, they're her sons, her boys, and her husband. She's all alone. So she arises and is going to come back from Moab because she hears that the Lord had visited his people. This word visit is a complex word. It can mean to punish, to visit in punishment, like, you better go clean your room because in 5 minutes I'm going to visit your room and it better be clean. That sort of a thing, versus visit in a sense of graciously caring for someone. So it seems the latter here, that the Lord has intervened to give his people bread. So the Lord now directly comes to the fore. He intervenes to provide bread. All right, well, our time is up, but let's turn over the handout, and I just want to point out a couple things here. I'll let you work through this. This is, to me, a very interesting discussion, and I kind of wish we had a little more time to develop this, but the question is often asked in the commentaries and other monographs and articles, was Elimelech's demise the result of divine judgment? In other words, are they being judged? So on the left-hand column, I have a commentator, Daniel Block, who says yes. And he gives all the reasons why he thinks that they were being judged by God. On the right-hand column, I have another commentator, Robert Chisholm, who says no. They weren't necessarily being judged by God. And so I have all the rationale for why he says it's not the case. All right, so you're probably wondering, where do you stand? What do you think? I would say this, that if it's possible to be in the middle, definite maybe, I would say this. I would posit that they're not necessarily being divinely judged because the narrator doesn't tell us that's the case. So I'm careful not to just jump into that. And part of that reason is also, I've studied Job most of my life, and what do the three friends of Job do? They immediately assume he's being judged by God. So I don't know that that's the case, but I would say this. It seems that God is hidden in some sense. They don't know what's going on, so they're trying to understand what is happening, what is the Lord doing. And I will say this, that they do move, I think, outside of the land, and that puts them in a threatening, precarious situation. So I don't know that I'd go so far as to say God has divinely judged them and this is why they all die. But they're experiencing the futility, the seeming emptiness that comes from living outside what seems to be the sphere of God's blessing. But of course they would say, well, we have to do this to preserve life. So at the end, the narrator never really tells us, is this the hand of God? All the narrator says is God does come to provide bread. There are only two instances where, as Chisholm notes in that last point, where God is said directly to intervene, to do something, to give bread, and then to give Ruth fertility. Terry, you had a thought?
I had thought of, it also is like a story, if God knows he has a believer, and the believer is a Moabite, he orchestrated all of those things for Ruth, too. Because she eventually goes back to the promised land, and through her, Christ and his line come. So, it could be like a beautiful story of salvation.
Yeah, it definitely is. It's a beautiful portrayal of redemption. In some sense, Ruth redeems Naomi, Boaz redeems Ruth, and so it's a very beautifully put together story. All right, Michael.
The idea of moving because of famine is not exclusive to Ruth. We have other stories in the Old Testament that come to mind.
Right.
And the aspect of judgment doesn't pop up immediately, as I think some of the others.
Right.
But in most of the stories, the outcome, I can't think of all the outcomes, but God does use those situations, and there is a returning.
Right.
Theme that can be applied to some of the others.
Right. Right. So that seems to be the case here. Without getting into all the details, we just don't know. Sometimes famines are neutral. Sometimes it's happened and we're not told why. Other times we're told in Deuteronomy, if you disobey, you will experience famine. So I can see why some would make the cause and effect relationship, but in this case we just don't know.
I'm always taken by the fact that we kind of see in this book, as I was reading it, that we see how we cannot know the will of God unless we look back. But we can clearly see the permissive will of God. Mm-hmm. Right. And that they leave the land and maybe they're being punished. Maybe that's why they all die. But then we also see this character Ruth who comes in, a Moabitess, and we can clearly see the permissive will of God and how he then takes that and gives us our Messiah.
Right.
So that, I was doing some reading this past week where it says, look, we're never going to know the mind of God and his will. It's going to happen the way that he wants it to happen. But what we normally can see is his permissive will. And in the very opening first chapter, I was moved. Because you see that happening all the time in the first chapter. Mm-hmm. You see God's will now. We can see it, of course, all these millennia later. But you can see the permissive will of God happening all the time. And then we take that and we can apply it to our lives. And we say, God, where are you? Or we can turn to Scripture and say, wow, we can see God's will occurring just exactly when he wanted it. So I'm going to trust his permissive will when it's right there in my face. Mm-hmm. That's what I took away.
Yeah, that's great. That's good. All right, well, that's a good comment, I think, to close on. So our takeaway just from this opening vignette is the fact that God is sovereign even when events seem to obscure his providence. And so that's really the application principle that I included. Trust God for his sovereign and gracious direction of your present and future circumstances, even if you feel like you are in exile. God will bring life out of death and redemption. All right, so let's close in prayer, and we'll be dismissed. Father, we are thankful for even this brief study this morning of these few verses, and I pray that you would help this lesson to permeate our hearts as we think about how you bring life out of death. I pray, Lord, that we would see that power of redemption playing out in our own lives. I pray that we might be faithful bearers of the gospel, because we know that this book points ultimately to the greater David, Jesus Christ, who did come and gave his life for us and paid the penalty for our sins and gave us his righteousness. And I thank you that we can serve him as believers united together in this church. And so, Lord, we ask that you would help us in this coming week to be faithful to you, to honor you, and to glorify you in all that you've called us to do. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen.